such a large part of oral narrative is this idea of stories morphing, evolving, and changing based on audience, based on who heard the story and who's telling it later. And for a long time, I have felt like this is sort of the downfall of oral narrative, is the fact that it morphs with time. But after I've thought about it, really, it's this really interesting balance between canon and an artistry that is storytelling. Like I mentioned in the Whoa, Bright Light story, it is unknown who actually said those words. And depending on who's telling it, I believe when my brother Clayton tells the story, he tells it as though he is the one who said Whoa, Bright Light, which is the infamous term in our family. Whoa, bright light. And it changes with time. And the question that comes to my mind is, does it truly matter how it actually happened? Because the moment that we take a story in, it already starts to morph based on our sensibilities and the parts in it that stand out to us. These things have been on my mind recently because I have long been opposed to Audible, which is taking books and having them be an audiobook where someone reads the book and you just listen to it. And for a long time did not like the idea of Audible because I am a somewhat slow reader, and I would argue that I take a lot of detail in when I'm reading a story. I'll stop and think about things. I'll mark passages, and part of this comes from the fact that I'm an aspiring author, I'm a writer, and I'm wanting to learn from the things that I'm reading. And so when you're listening to a story, you can't always pause it and try and learn from it, learn how things are working. You're just taking it all in a moment. And so I was really resistant to Audible for a long time. The other thing, and I'm going to get on a little bit of a soapbox here, I've met so many people that do Audible, and their favorite thing about Audible is they can listen to it as at double speed. I've even had a friend who told me they're really proud to say that they're able to listen to Audible on almost 3 times speed or something like that. And this also goes very much against just me as a digester of stories. I'm like, what? Like, what's the hurry? Why do you want it to be over so quickly? And the counter argument is there's so much out there that people want to experience that they're like, the quicker I can get through a book, the quicker I can be on to the next one. And I can kind of get that sensibility, but I have to believe that when you're listening to something at double speed, that you're not taking in as much of if it's an educational, if it's nonfiction, you're not taking in as much as the details. And if it's fiction, you're missing parts in it, and it may be moving at a pace quicker than it was intended or in its best form. But that's neither here nor there. That's sort of just me. That's the reason that I've been resistant to Audible. But recently, on a long drive, my wife and I, on a drive, we started listening to this guy right here, Green Lights by Matthew McConaughey. And I have to say that it was one of the most rewarding experiences I've had in a long time, partly because Matthew McConaughey actually reads the Audible book himself. So it's like, it's oral narrative. I was hearing Matthew McConaughey's inflection, his voice, his interpretation of the words. First off, Green Lights is a really, really awesome book. Not for kids, but definitely a lot of adult content in it, just in terms of language mostly. But it was so cool to hear it from Matthew McConaughey's own perspective, and I've wanted to get the book and compare notes because I think there's parts of it that are sort of added by Matthew McConaughey. Throughout it, he'll chuckle and be like, "Ha, green light." And I just have to believe that those ha-has and those little moments where you can tell that he gets excited aren't necessarily in the book. And that got me really thinking a lot about oral narrative and the power of sharing a story just from yourself with an audience, and the person actually telling the story being part of the artistry of that story. On top of that, I have also been listening to Norse Mythology by Neil Gaiman, and it has been super rewarding. And in the back of my mind, some of the things that Neil Gaiman says at the beginning of the book about how these stories were passed on generation after generation, told orally for a long time before they were finally written down. And you can picture yourself gathered around a fire and listening to someone share these fantastical stories about Thor and Odin and Loki. And it's just amazing to me to think of how much these stories drove a culture and a society and how important they were. They were the backbone of the culture and the way they interpreted this world. And part of me just missed that. It was strange to be missing something that I've never truly experienced other than when my dad would come down and share a story. But I just imagine having this whole community of people that would love to gather and just listen to a story be told. And I want to be a part of that. And so I wanted to share this episode just because, honestly, because these things have been on my mind, but also because I wanted an opportunity to share some of the stories that I've experienced or some of the stories that I love, and to do it with my own voice and with my own inflection, and sort of partake and participate in the story at another level. And so I have to say that I've come around to, just in the past probably 3 months, I've come around to really, really like this idea of oral narrative. And of course, doing my podcast and my YouTube, sharing these stories from my upbringing and from my youth has been very rewarding. One, to get them down documented, but two, to be able to just share them with an audience